We are now ready for our very first conversation of the day. And this is a beautiful conversation in the sense that it allows us just to take a step back and to lift our heads a little bit, to take a helicopter view, and to speak to the question of what are the dominant and prevalent trends in CSI and philanthropy that are really shaping this moment right here. And I'm going to invite Nick Rockey, who is the Managing Director of Trialogue, onto the stage, together with Nicolette Naylor, the founder and CEO of Ubuntu Global Philanthropy and the Gender Justice Consulting. Let's give them both a round of applause as they come up. I'm going to invite you to take the two seats closest to me. Thank you. Thanks, Nicolette. Now, I want to start with just a very short preamble, but then we're going to go to a poll, then we're going to come to the conversation. And the preamble is this. I think if we reflect on yesterday, there were a couple of moments where we touched on the macro environment and what's happening at a geopolitical level. And what we are seeing, and I don't want to highlight the US only, but to say predominantly coming from the US, we've seen a massive cut in aid funding. I mentioned, Nicolette, I know you weren't here yesterday, I mentioned that I just come back from Seattle where the Gates Foundation made that announcement of exiting in about 20 years. But we're seeing bigger conversations, USAID, PEPFAR, and so on. We're seeing a pushback on DEI in particular. We're seeing a CSI agenda that seems to be very closely linked to political agendas, and almost the two are becoming almost difficult to separate. And the impact is what we want to talk about in this conversation. We want to explore what this means for traditional funding models. We want to explore what this means in terms of how do we then navigate an environment where there's reduced aid, where there's a lot more politicking. How do we navigate the increased demand for proof of impact? And how do we also explore the reality that there seems to be a little bit of a blur between what accounts for grant funding and what is investment, and where do the two meet, and what does that space look like exactly? And what I'd love to do is that I wouldn't want to keep Nicolette and Nick to myself. So I'm really wanting to encourage you to pop through your questions. I probably have a couple of questions for them, but I want to come to you with your questions very soon. But before we get to the questions, let's do a quick poll together. It's going to pop up on your app again. And the question now is, how has the reduction in USAID and other aid impacted your work? So if we think about this moment in history, how is it impacting your work? Has it had no impact on your work at all? Or is your response that we've invested more to support impacted nonprofits, and so maybe you're stepping into the space, into this arena as a corporate that is investing more and closing some of those shocks and gaps that have emerged? Or are you a nonprofit saying, no, we've lost income and we've just had to scale back and we have had to pull back? So I see that the poll is up. I'd love to see some of the reactions. And I think what it will do, Nicolette and Nick, is that it gives us a sense of who's in the room and how they're experiencing this global outcome. So 88% for now. We've got about 50 people who already voted. Let's give it at least a minute. But runaway right now at about 87% is no impact on our work at all. A very small percent at 4% saying, well, we've stepped in to close some of these gaps. We've invested more to support impacted nonprofits. And about 14-15% saying, we've lost income and we've had to scale back. I want to give that a little bit more time. I want to give it about 30 seconds. We've got about 60 people who have participated. And what I'm seeing is that number is still ticking up as people are coming online and beginning to participate. And that's an interesting one, because as I look at that result, I wonder whether there's a time lag that we need to take into consideration, but I think you will let us know. Fantastic. I think that's the result. We'll keep it at the back of our minds. It's not changing much. 80%, 6%, and 16%. And so maybe, Nick, let's locate this conversation in the context of South Africa in particular. What are some of the dominant trends that you're seeing amongst companies, and how are these evolving over the years? And perhaps you could also touch on the shift from strategic CSI to leverage CSI. If you have an immediate comment on what you're seeing on screen, you're welcome to go there as well.
No, thanks very much. Yeah, I think the shifts are definitely happening, and not immediate, it's gradual. So
Yes.
we've watched this space for many years now through our research. And I think in the early days we saw a lot of what is sometimes still perceived to be what CSI is about, and check writing and
Yeah.
reactive grants. And it still happens, and there's a place for that. I do believe that. And I think most of the funding now is in what we call a strategic CSI space.
Yes.
And what that looks like is that there are flagship programs, there's investment for more than just 1 year.
Yeah.
Companies get more involved. Sometimes companies actually drive programs themselves on an indefinite basis, so they're not getting in and getting out quickly. And building an M&E around those projects. You know,
Yeah.
if you're in and out quickly, it's very difficult to justify spending money on monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah.
And increasingly companies were saying, well, what's the impact? You know, there's 12.7 billion, whatever that number is in actual terms. Where's the impact? Are we seeing it? And can we have a systemic impact? And we've introduced this notion called leverage CSI, where you use your grants to actually create an impact outside of the boundaries of the program that you're directly involved in, through advocacy, through research, through lobbying, government or where funds are outside of that. And there's a lot of interest in that space. Obviously, collaborative processes are required there. But it's new.
Yeah.
So the language is starting to shift.
Yeah.
Behavior is probably still locked back in the sort of in the box of more strategic CSI.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see examples come through. I mean, CSI at 12.7 billion is less than 1% of what government's spending.
Yeah.
So you can't expect CSI programs to deliver what is primarily a government mandate. It's just impossible.
Yeah.
You know, we can't pay salaries for teachers because we'll get dwarfed. The impact will be dwarfed there. But through this conference, we hear about how corporates are innovating, how they're using data intelligently, etc., and how through that they
Yeah.
can actually start leveraging and having a greater impact. So I think it's more language now.
Yeah.
We're starting to see companies reflect that language. We're starting to see them think about where they are investing, not necessarily entirely all of their budget into
Sure.
those sort of spaces, but to really think how they can build on the work that they're doing to have a greater impact. It's interesting, I was talking to an NPO at one of the breaks yesterday,
Yes.
and they were saying now companies are saying, well, can you include in your work systemic impact? But that's not a button you push, you know.
Sure.
It's a lot of work to get there.
Yeah.
It takes thinking, it takes a design approach. But great that they're being pushed in that direction, that people are thinking about that.
So, Nick, just very quickly before I move on, because I think it's such an interesting point you make that we're potentially opening ourselves and learning the language of leverage CSI. We're not quite there yet by a long shot in terms of the practice. What do you think would make the ultimate shift that would really get us into a space where we're really looking at how do we leverage CSI where it is to have a much more wider impact?
Yeah, I think it's got to be an intent in the design of the programs.
Sure.
And who you work with and how you work with them. So I mentioned that I think collaborative processes are critical. You know, government can't, if you're going to influence government or trying to influence government policy, they haven't got the bandwidth to have a conversation with every company out there.
Yeah.
But if there's a critical mass of energy in a particular space, and if that space is there's a legitimate and really well considered design of approach,
Yeah.
with outcomes that are being tested and researched and monitored, you've got a much better opportunity to go in there and look at what can shift and how you shift. And I think thinking about what you're trying to shift
Yeah.
is important at the outset. You don't just sort of blunder into a space and then say, how are we going to have systemic impact here?
Got
One
you.
needs to be deliberate about that, I think.
A critical mass of energy. I love the use of that language. Nicolette, if we look at that screen again, the question I want to bring to you is, what are the short-term and the long-term impacts of this picture that we're seeing? In particular, if we look at impact on health, because I think that's where we've seen the focus in terms of USAID and PEPFAR. And I suppose the unasked question in all of that is, how do we buffer the shock that is coming with this picture?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. That's quite an interesting result there in terms of the no impact on our work, because I do think that all sectors are going to be impacted by the reduction in development aid. And I want to broaden this beyond USAID, because what's happened with USAID isn't new. 5 years ago, we've seen a trend in overseas development assistance. The global consensus, the post-Cold War consensus around the role of development aid and development assistance is no longer there. We've seen countries like Sweden. Since 1975, Sweden has been the top contributor to Africa's development aid. South Africa has benefited from Swedish CEDA, Swedish aid, the Nordic countries, European aid. And with right-wing governments coming into power, we've seen a shift in priorities away from Africa to Europe. 2 years ago, putting development aid towards Ukraine and a European agenda and curbing the flow of migration. Netherlands in 2024, we saw massive cuts in the ODA budget towards Africa. We've seen about 2.4 billion euros cut last year in aid. That impacts on the continent, that impacts on the development sector, and it's impacting on governments. Governments, and so the impact, it may not impact on your work, but it's impacting on government in terms of the heavy dependence and reliance that governments have had on Nordic countries, European aid, and USAID. So before we get to Trump and executive orders, we need to look at the last year, the shift to the right in Europe. The UK government, the first time in decades that a Labour government has reduced development aid by 50%. It's going to a security agenda and a military agenda. Again, that impacts on FCDO and the work in this country. It impacts on the continent in dramatic ways. And so we're going to have a ripple effect. The immediate effect, when we then get to USAID, you see that governments across the continent have become overly dependent. The health system, the HIV programming has relied extensively on USAID. South Africa has been better than most countries, South Africa and Kenya, because we support 80% of our HIV program, government funds itself. But there's a 20% gap. If you look at Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania, 90% of their health system, their HIV programming is funded by USAID. Zambia, 80%. I was in Uganda last week. 70% of their budget was funded by USAID. I met with LGBT organizations and they were saying LGBT work is criminalized in Uganda. For LGBT people to go and get services, they were reliant on USAID clinics that are all shut down. And so I also think we have to think about this across borders and what the impact is on the continent and what the impact is in South Africa. You now have a climate of scarcity where everyone, the development sector, the NGO sector that works on health, education, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender work, the gender work has been decimated because of these cuts in funding, are all going to be scrambling to find alternative resources. And what's that going to mean? Coming to philanthropy, coming to CSR, and government themselves looking for alternative resourcing. And I don't think it's realistic to think that the CSR sector, the philanthropy, international philanthropy sector is going to plug those gaps. And I'll end by saying, I do think there's an opportunity in this moment, because I don't want us, we've romanticized development aid for too long. There's been a critique of the dependence model. It's created dependence. NGOs have become dependent, governments have become dependent on aid, and I think it encourages all of us to think about how do we shift from a dependence model to an independent model and a more sustainable model, that when this funding dries up, organizations don't shut down. The fact that so many sexual and reproductive health organizations, women's rights, HIV organizations are having to shut their doors is an indictment on all of us that fund this work, in terms of the fact that organizations have to shut down. What does that say for the way we funded work to build sustainability and to build independence?
And maybe Nick, just to riff on that, because Nicolette speaks about an opportunity to transition from dependence to independence from the perspective of governments and NGOs. Is there an opportunity for how business then thinks about their role in this particular landscape in the context of what's happening with all these geopolitical shifts and this reduction in aid that we're seeing? What does this mean for the role of business?
Yeah, I don't think business should see this as filling a funding hole.
Sure.
You know, there was money there, we should put money in. That's not their role. I think business should think about it strategically, as they are doing. Where can they have the greatest impact within their sphere of influence? And this is where we talk about, you know, being aligned to the work that you're in. You know, if you're a tech company like an MTN or Vodacom or Telkom, you know, you can influence the world, the tech world. You can you connect it to government in that space. You can look at your business footprint and how CSI can support that work. So we spoke on day one. We had a shared value strategic CSI class. So how does CSI enable the business to have a greater social and environmental positive impact?
Yeah.
And how do you leverage CSI for those purposes? And I think that's the thinking that business needs to come back to, as opposed to thinking with where should we place our funding?
Yeah.
Excuse me. So yeah, I think it's more the same, but it's more aligned, it's more strategic, and it's more leveraged. And I think that's where the role of business, and it came through in multiple times in different formats in day one.
Yeah. I would agree with that, Nick, because I think about the tendency that we've seen is that from from a government perspective, when the fiscus fails to reach certain service delivery milestones, the expectation, especially in the South African context, is that business then steps in to close that gap. And that in itself seems to be a very worrying trend and cycle of business coming to the rescue for some of the fundamental things that should be the outcome of a functioning government and a functioning society. And I think it's interesting that you make that point, that this is not the moment where you just step in and fill the gap, but to actually think strategically about how do you then leverage where CSI is already. But I don't want to have a doom and gloom conversation, Nicolette, so I'm going to try and lift it a little bit, and then I'm going to go to the audience. Is there, I mean, this is not the first time in history where there's been a shift in sort of the trends that are shaping aid in particular. Is there best practice in terms of how you navigate that space, how NGOs navigate that space, how they do that in partnership with business, so that even as we find ourselves in this, and I almost feel that the international relations book will talk about a Trump moment in history for a very long time. How do we navigate this? Is there best practice?
I worry about using the word best practice. I feel like we went through the COVID crisis, a global health pandemic.
Yes.
And we came up with innovative ways we sort of threw out our toolboxes and we thought about different ways of working and shifting. And we saw more shifts in philanthropy in that period of COVID than we'd seen in the previous 2 decades in terms of more flexible funding, core funding, changing reporting structures, breaking down silos between work, the fragmentation of the work and the sector. We're now facing a global economic crisis, and we're facing another crisis in terms of the aid structure. Philanthropy itself is under threat in many parts of the world, and Organizations in South Africa rely on CSR funding, local funding, and get a large portion of their funding from US philanthropy. US philanthropy is under threat at the moment. It's like everyone's preparing for executive orders to arrive that restrict the tax-exempt status, restrict international funding, and return to an America First agenda.
Yeah.
We can't sit back and wait for that to happen.
Sure.
And be reactive like we were with COVID. We need to be planning for the future, how we almost firewalling ourselves in terms of a day that's going to come where these funds are no longer available, and what does that mean? And I think we're not there yet. After COVID, we've reverted to sitting back and doing work business as usual. We are operating, and I think this is for NGOs and for the philanthropy sector, the CSR sector, we are operating in a model, a 1980s model, in terms of how NGOs are structured, the way we're doing our work, the way we write grants. It's a 1980s model. We're in the 21st century. The world has shifted fundamentally. And we're writing individual grants for 2 years with a spend-down model, spend all the money, show me a nil balance, don't save, don't invest, don't build reserves, deliver on the project. We're still focusing on projects versus sustainability of a sector and investing in a sector. I spoke to a corporate based in Germany yesterday, a corporate foundation, a big brand, and they were saying, look, we've always focused on health and education in our work.
Sure.
In Germany and around the world. And this moment has made us realize that we need to also look at democracy. We need to look at some big issues. How is democracy? What is the relationship between health and democracy in this moment? And how do we reimagine the way we do our funding to break down the silos as seeing something as only a health issue or an education issue? And how are we funding organizations in ways, and we're seeing a trend now in US philanthropy where they're saying as we spend down, as we're leaving a field, we're giving people a grant and saying, do with it as you wish. And if you need to save this money, save it, invest it. Here's some investment consultants so that you can exist for 10 years because we as a US foundation don't know if we're going to be around for 10 years. That's innovation, I think. This model, the CSR sector and the philanthropy sector, I'm afraid, has continued on a dependent model, come back to us every 2 years. And this notion that core flexible funding is innovative, come on. Yes, it's innovative, and it was innovative like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
We need to move beyond core flexible funding to think about sustainability and a whole different way of how we fund organizations. And NGOs need to say, are we fit for purpose? Is our structure fit for purpose? Do we need more coalitions? Do we need more alliances of organizations to work together? Because we use this rhetoric of systems change. No single organization can deliver systems change. No single foundation can deliver systems change, yet our funding doesn't reflect coalition models of funding to bring about that kind of systems change, working with government, working with, you have a meeting of CSR meets on one side, international philanthropy meets on the other side, NGOs meet on the other side. We need a big tent approach. The world is on fire, and we're still meeting in sectoral silos and thematic silos and operating on a 1980s model of grant making.
Sure.
So sorry, that's not best practice.
And I didn't want to interrupt that because I think you paint that disconnect so well between, on the one hand, funders, investors who have moved on, and on the other hand, recipients who are operating in a different paradigm. But Nick, and I'm going to go to the audience after this, but the conversation is increasingly talking about what we're hearing Nicolette say: innovative financing, blended financing, what is the other one? Social impact bonds, catalytic capital. I mean, the list is long, and there's always a sexier, fresher framing of finance that is being spoken about, venture philanthropy being another one of them. The question is, from a company perspective, how does one participate meaningfully? How do you really get into this arena and be part of the solution in transitioning yourself away from the 1980s model as well, and making sure that you're engaging with a financing model that's fit for purpose?
Yeah, I think what often happens is companies think in isolated projects, and what needs to happen is what's going on in that space. To discover what are the major initiatives. If there's a 300 million rand bond being generated, it won't be generated out of a company. It's generated out of Treasury, or
Yes.
it's a bond for jobs or a jobs boost fund or whatever the case is. If you're there creating jobs, do you know what those funds are doing? How do you link into those funds? How can you play a role in a bigger initiative? And it's not necessarily just a financing initiative.
Sure.
There could be other collaborative processes. And can those collaborative processes draw in to similar initiatives into a space where collectively you can work together? So we're seeing, I think there are innovative funds. Bertha down in Cape is very strong in terms of innovating in that space. And we're seeing some organizations dip into that. The Standard Bank to Tour organization as a foundation is set itself up to try and innovate and supports a number of these initiatives. Corporates aren't really geared for it. They're still, as Nicolette was saying, into the grant sort of mindset. If you go to your trustees or your board and say, well, we want to invest in a backbone organization or an outcome or whatever the case is, they're not used to that. And I think that's where those internal structures need to change. They're also, I think, dependent on something being theirs. And if you go along and say, well, we want to be part in the much bigger initiative,
Sure.
they're going to say, well, we're going to lose the brand in that process.
Exactly.
And we won't stand out. But yesterday, there was a discussion and a point raised. This is about making the deal. Everyone gets what they want out of it. You put something in, and what do you get out of it?
Yeah.
And there is absolutely that potential. And yes, you might not be the primary funder, but you could potentially fund an element of that project and own that element. You could participate in different ways. We also spoke about, yesterday it came up, how corporates have so much to contribute that's not just purely money.
Absolutely.
They can contribute people, they can contribute knowledge,
Technology,
they
space.
can systems, IT knowledge, etc., etc. And a lot of these initiatives could do well with that. But that creates a slightly, it requires the company or the people, representing the CSI program to have linkages into the business and to have permission to draw from the business in different ways. So we look at one of our models as how integrated is the CSI program within the company. How many points in the company is it touching, as opposed to being the sort of isolated function.
Yeah.
And as NPOs, I think, I think a healthy relationship is where you have a partnership with a company. You understand the company's agenda, and you're a critical partner in helping them deliver that agenda. And then there's a sustainability plan in that. That you're in it together. You can be honest about what's working and what's not working, because you're on the same side of the fence and you're both driving it together, as opposed to this hide if it's not working because we might lose the funding type
That's a
mindset.
fantastic question that you're bringing into the frame. How do we ask questions around the extent of integration and alignment to the delivery of the strategy and the execution of the strategy? I'm taking a couple of questions now, and I love this one. I'm going to kick off with it. It's from Jacques. And Jacques says, what advice can you give to assist NGOs to go from asking for fish to rather fishing for themselves? So Nicolette, let me put that to you. One piece of advice, and I'd love to hear, Nick, your thoughts as well. How do we, and I think it's the underlying sustainability question. What is one definitive action that you think would really help with that transition?
Well, I think it's not only to put the burden on NGOs, because there's a demand and supply side to this equation where people need to come together and say, what does this moment call for right now?
Yeah.
There's projects that need to be delivered. There's important work on the ground that needs to be done. But we as an NGO, we're trying to think about our own sustainability and our own independence for the long haul. And so we want to come up with a partnership model where you're investing in us and you're investing in the work we're doing and what we're going to deliver, but you're also investing in us in terms of how we're thinking about our own sustainability and independence. And so every single proposal that gets put, when people are invited to submit proposals, needs to build in what is your sustainability plans look like and how much of that grant you want that partner to invest in. And so I think it's about also thinking about this in terms of an investment mindset and not a recipient mindset, and walking away from money that has too much conditionalities attached to it.
Sure.
Just say no. This is a mutually symbiotic relationship, and either the partnership works and you're negotiating the partnership on the basis of key principles around sustainability and your own existence as an NGO, as well as the work that you're doing, and CSRs are approaching it in the same way. And so it requires us to reimagine that negotiation in the donor contract relationship.
It requires us to reimagine the negotiation in the donor contract. So beautifully captured. I'm not going to bring the same question to you because the platform is going crazy. There are more questions. So did you want to make a comment?
Something to that? I think, if you're sitting as an NPO, you have a unique value that you bring to the table.
Sure.
What is that unique value, and how does that value help solve someone else's issue and problem? If you really understand data systems, as you saw yesterday in the ECD space, you can bring such value to the table in the way that you do your work, and finding people and finding those linkages, so that the NPOs have enormous developmental know-how. Corporates don't have that. They're not developmental people, typically. They learn, but they rely on NPOs. So there is a codependency. And when that codependency kicks in, you're no longer asking for fish. You actually, you're part of the solution.
So the arrow has to move both ways. And for as long as it's just in the one direction, you probably have a challenge. So Nick, let me bring this one to you first. This is from Kanyisa. Kanyisa says, in recent years, we've observed a growing trend of corporates moving away from partnerships with NGOs and instead establishing their own foundations to directly implement community development projects. Does this shift signal a gradual erosion or even the potential demise of the traditional NGO sector as we know it?
I think that is happening. Companies own their projects, and it's that's a strategic choice. It's not necessarily the best way or the worst way to do it. It's got its pros and cons. You can't exit quickly if you own something. And typically when they own projects or drive those projects themselves, they bring NPOs in as partners to help them deliver those solutions. And I think that point was made with the MP and Skills Academy yesterday.
Yes.
It is a trend. It's got some advantages, I think, in that if it is yours, you typically have greater ability to pull from the organization different resources. It's typically going to be supported at a more strategic level within the company. Some of the disadvantages is that if you're outside of your comfort zone and your knowledge space, you aren't necessarily the most informed to actually deliver that project, whereas an NPO partner might have better knowledge in that space. But I think there's still, even in that model, I think there is a role for it and a space for it. But in that model, there's definitely a role for NPOs to provide the thinking and the developmental know-how in that space. I don't think it's going to fundamentally shift the way, it's not going to displace or disintermediate NPOs, I don't think.
Nicolette, I can see you want to come in on that one as well.
I think that we need to interrogate how we see where does expertise lie in solving problems, where are the experts, and because sometimes we use the rhetoric of we want to put communities at the center, communities know best, those closest to the problem know how to solve the problem. And so if that's our analysis, that there's expertise in NGOs who know this work, but there's also gaps in what NGOs can offer, and that's where corporates have something to offer, then you get to that symbiosis. But if one side feels they know more and they are the experts, And I think we need to practice humility here, because if we were so good at what we were doing, we would have solved a lot of problems in this country. We have failed. Can we just accept that? We have not. We keep patting ourselves on the back. We have not solved the education crisis. We have not solved the health crisis.
Yeah.
And we're never going to be able to do that on our own. So if we start from a humility perspective, like we're not making enough progress, we need to do something differently and work collectively with government, with others. I think that's a helpful way of looking at it versus who owns the project. This does require us, a systems approach requires one to leave logos and egos at the door.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation about the return on ego yesterday, because that seems to be the thing that's being traded in the deal making that we're talking about, and whose logo, whose logos get centered. And I think you bring an interesting angle, Nicolette, and that is to decouple the question of ownership from the brand recognition conversation as well. But Sonia's asking a different question, and let me bring this to you, Nicolette, and then Nick, I'd love you to hear your thoughts on it as well. Sonia's saying, is it not critical to get SARS on board in terms of encouraging NPOs to become independent and self-sustainable? Currently, NPOs are not encouraged to generate their own income. And so, in other words, how do we leverage the taxation architecture as an impetus and a catalyst to really invigorate the CSI sector? Your thoughts on that, and I'd love to hear you, Nick, as well.
And this is my point around the 1980s model of the NPO. We actually need a different structure for this moment, a structure that can generate, that can be income generating and can also do the work of social good. The notion that the social good work happens in an NPO structure, that's quite limiting in terms of sustainability and income generation, and our tax structure just in terms of philanthropy itself needs an overhaul. But I think there again, how can business and NPOs work together? And in other parts of the world, the clampdown on NGOs, we're seeing this in the US, we're seeing this in Europe, where you're getting laws passed that is really limiting what NGOs can do and can't do, and it's required NGOs to set up different entities to think about themselves more as social entrepreneurs and an entrepreneurship model versus an NGO model. And I think that's much more 21st century than this 1980s NGO model and the NPO structure that we've sort of confined ourselves to. That does require advocacy in terms of the legal framework, but I do think that's doable if all the different sectors come together, not just the NGO sector, to push for those kinds of changes, and for registration processes to look beyond the NPO model, and those funding NPOs to say we can also look to fund outside of the NPO model.
Sure. And maybe to position the question slightly broader for you, Nick, and just your comments on the taxation architecture and the role that it can play in really helping us transition even from strategic to leverage CSI and deepen impact and scale impact. Is there a different way we could reimagine taxation?
No, I mean, I think that obviously companies can get Section 18A and tax exemption. That exists, and that's going to, I think, as far as I can see, stay in place. If you look at the NPO itself, they will get funding from whatever source. And what's an ideal? An ideal is that you get multiple sources of funding, you have reserves, potentially some self-generated income. Not every NPO is going to achieve that or necessarily should achieve that. If you are an NPO dependent on redistributing food that comes out of some of the big retailers, for example, that's what you do. To go and set up an entrepreneurial business where you're going to be baking, set up a bakery, you're not geared for that necessarily. And there have been attempts at people saying, well, you must generate, we're going to pull our funding, therefore you must generate your own income. And this NPO is not really geared to actually do a completely, to drive a completely different model. So there's a sense of realism and practicality in the space that you're in. Obviously work on getting multiple sources, reducing the dependency on one organization. But if you're a partner and you're dependent on that partner to distribute, and you're acting almost at a service level for that organization, there's going to be a dependency.
Sure.
And that's your reality. And if that partner says, well, sorry, we're going to change tack and not, that does threaten your existence.
So I want to close off the conversation with the final question to each of you. Nick, to you first. What, in your view, is the future of CSI in South Africa? Nicolette, the question to you is, what do you see as the future of philanthropy in South Africa? To Nick first.
Yeah, I think what we would love to see is, there are a lot of organizations, NPOs and companies doing similar work in a similar space and not really sharing what's working and what's not working and not coming together. What we would love to see in the next generation is to have communities of practice, or call them whatever, where there is this coming together, and whatever it is, an ECD program, or it's a maths and technology used for maths and schooling, or whatever the case is. What are the different models out there? What's working? What could be scaled? At what's the cost effectiveness of these different models? They all have a role. How do they interface? What can come together and actually be scaled? What can be used to innovate and take back to government as practice that they need to start thinking about? And I think having pockets of those initiatives and that understanding and collaborative processes that get built in and around that, and funding patterns that flow in and around that, I think that we could start to see shifts taking place.
Absolutely love that. I've put it down as the 3 C's: collective, collaborative, and I put the last one as catchment areas, like catchment pockets of excellence. I think you've summed that up beautifully. Nicolette, as you think about where to from here, what does the future, the emergent future, look like if we think about philanthropy in South Africa?
I think that never let a good crisis go to pause. And I think there is a crisis in philanthropy at the moment. But I do think that this space, I would love to see the CSI sector working with international philanthropy and local philanthropy more broadly. Particularly, there's an opportunity moment now with international philanthropy. So the Gates Foundation spend down over the next 20 years. There's a great opportunity there in terms of much larger amounts of money that they need to spend every year, much larger. So spend down models means a lot more spending. There's an offloading happening by US philanthropy at the moment to think about entities to invest in to get money out of the US. How does the CSI sector, the NGO sector in places like South Africa interface with those organizations to say, what does a partnership model look like if you're wanting to invest $1 billion in South Africa in health? What does a partnership model look like between government, international philanthropy, and the CSI and NGO sector to come up with different kinds of models and different kinds of funds? And so I think the lack of conversation, I worry about the lack of conversation between the Ford Foundations, the Open Societies, the Wellsprings, the Gates, that all have a presence in our country and are doing very similar work and supporting similar organizations. There needs to be that coming together moment. Collaboration is going to be critical. And I think reimagining how we think about impact and success, what success looks like, what sustainability looks like, what independence looks like, and working together. That's the future that I think is emergent. The only way we're going to get out of this moment. There is no savior that's going to be coming from the international philanthropy community, and there is no savior at the local level either. But collectively, there can be important work that can be done.
Sure. Conversations, and in the absence of those, that is where the future becomes even more uncertain. And what I'm hearing you say, and I think if I was counting, and I wasn't, but I'm sure the word reimagination has probably been one of the most used words throughout the conversations yesterday and this morning as well. A very big thank you to you, Nicolette, and to Nick for the conversation. Can we give them a very big round of applause? Thank you so very much. Thank you.